Hey everyone, welcome back to Steve's View. On February 20th, the Supreme Court of the United States did something that may turn out to be far more consequential than any single tariff announcement. It ruled that President Donald Trump could not rely on the 1977 International Emergency Economic Powers Act, better known as IEEPA, to impose the sweeping tariffs that had become a centerpiece of his trade strategy. And because this was the Supreme Court, not a lower court, the ruling took effect. There's no higher appeal. The message was clear: emergency economic powers are not a blank check for long-term trade policy. At first glance, this might sound like a narrow legal dispute, a statute from the Cold War era, a disagreement over executive authority. Another Washington power struggle. But if you zoom out, this is much bigger. This is about whether the United States can continue using tariffs as a rapid response geopolitical weapon, or whether the structure of the American system itself just placed a hard limit on that strategy. For years, tariffs looked like a powerful political tool. They were fast, they were unilateral, they didn't require Congress, they sent a signal, and they changed negotiating dynamics almost overnight. Countries that depended on access to the U.S. market suddenly faced immediate costs. That leverage helped Washington bring multiple partners to the table. Deals were framed as tough, reciprocal, transactional. The logic was simple. The United States is the world's largest consumer market. If you want access, you make concessions. But now we have to ask a more fundamental question. What happens when that leverage is legally constrained? To understand why this matters, we need to unpack what the court actually did. The International Emergency Economic Powers Act was passed in 1977 in a very different geopolitical environment. It was designed to give presidents authority to respond to genuine national emergencies, financial crises, foreign threats, destabilizing events. Over time, presidents of both parties used it to impose sanctions and freeze assets. But using it to redesign tariff policy on a broad scale was controversial. The Supreme Court's ruling effectively said, you can't stretch emergency authority into a permanent trade strategy. If you want to rewrite tariff structures, you need Congress. That's not just a technical correction. That's a structural boundary. And here's where it gets interesting. The United States has always operated under a separation of powers system. Trade authority is shared. Congress regulates commerce with foreign nations. The president negotiates and executes agreements. In practice, over decades, Congress delegated significant authority to the executive branch. That delegation made trade policy faster and more flexible, but flexibility also created the possibility of aggressive unilateral action. Now the court has reminded everyone, including foreign governments, that presidential power has limits. So what does that mean for global trade politics? Let's start with leverage. In recent years, tariffs weren't just about revenue. They were bargaining chips. They were signals of resolve. They were used to pressure countries to lower non-tariff barriers, adjust digital tax policies, cooperate on export controls, and align more closely with U.S. strategic priorities, especially in relation to China. When the White House could credibly threaten new tariffs at any time under emergency authority, negotiations carried urgency. Smaller economies, heavily dependent on exports, often moved quickly. Larger economies negotiated harder, but still faced the risk of escalation. Now imagine you're sitting in a trade ministry in Brussels, Tokyo, New Delhi, or Kuala Lumpur. You just watched the Supreme Court step in and say that the legal foundation for sweeping IEEPA-based tariffs doesn't hold. What does that do to your calculation? First, it changes the credibility of immediate threats. If future tariff moves require congressional authorization, they become slower, more politically complex, and potentially more uncertain. Markets can anticipate them. Lobby groups can mobilize. Congressional committees can intervene. That's a very different dynamic from executive action framed as emergency response. Second, it raises questions about durability. If a trade concession was extracted under legal authority that has now been invalidated, what does that mean for long-term commitments? Even if existing agreements remain politically intact, the psychological foundation shifts. Foreign governments now know that U.S. trade tools are not entirely at the discretion of one administration. But here's the paradox. This limitation could either weaken U.S. influence or strengthen it. Let's talk about the weakening scenario first. One argument is straightforward. If the president's ability to impose tariffs quickly is curtailed, Washington loses a sharp instrument. Negotiations become slower and less coercive. Countries might feel more comfortable resisting U.S. demands, knowing that escalation requires legislative consensus. In a polarized Congress, that consensus is far from guaranteed. From this perspective, the court just reduced the shock value of American trade policy. It made it more procedural, less immediate. And in geopolitics, speed can matter. But there's another way to see it. The U.S. system is often criticized abroad for unpredictability. One administration signs an agreement, another withdraws. One president imposes tariffs, another questions them. For businesses making 20-year investment decisions, semiconductor plants, energy infrastructure, supply chain realignments, that volatility is risky. By drawing a constitutional boundary, the Supreme Court may have signaled something stabilizing. U.S. trade policy cannot swing entirely on executive discretion. It must rest, at least in part, on congressional authorization. That could make future policy slower, but also more durable. Think about how multinational corporations evaluate political risk. They don't just look at who occupies the White House. They assess institutional constraints. If trade policy requires broader political buy-in than once enacted, it may be harder to reverse. In that sense, the court's ruling might transform U.S. trade power from being rapid and tactical to being slower, but more structural. Now zoom out even further. Trade policy today is not just about tariffs. It's about supply chains, export controls, industrial subsidies, digital regulations, energy transitions, and strategic competition. The Trump-era use of tariffs under IEEPA was one piece of a broader toolkit aimed at reshaping global economic relationships. If that specific tool is restricted, what replaces it? We may see increased reliance on other statutory authorities. Section 301 investigations, anti-dumping and countervailing duties, national security tariffs under Section 232, and more aggressive use of export controls. We may see greater emphasis on industrial policy, subsidies, tax incentives, reshoring initiatives. We may see tighter coordination with allies on technology controls rather than unilateral tariff escalation. In other words, the instrument changes. The strategy might not, but there is a structural shift here that's worth emphasizing. When trade becomes deeply intertwined with national security, the temptation to expand executive power grows. Emergencies justify speed. Strategic rivalry justifies exceptional measures. The Supreme Court's decision pushes back against that expansion. It says, even in an era of geopolitical tension, there are limits. That matters not just for domestic law, but for global perception. Foreign governments constantly assess how centralized U.S. power is. A system where one leader can rapidly alter trade conditions may be intimidating, but it is also unpredictable. A system where courts can overrule the executive may appear messy, but it signals institutional resilience. So does this ruling change the structure of global trade competition? I would argue yes, but not in the simplistic sense of America lost leverage. It changes the tempo and the credibility framework of U.S. trade policy. Instead of asking, can the president impose tariffs tomorrow? Foreign governments may now ask, can the United States sustain this policy across branches of government? That's a different strategic question, and it cuts both ways. If Congress eventually codifies certain trade measures, they could carry more weight than executive orders ever did. But getting there requires political consensus, which is increasingly difficult in a polarized environment. There's also a domestic economic dimension. Tariffs function as taxes on imports. When imposed broadly, they can raise costs for consumers and businesses. The debate over their legality was partly a debate over economic impact. By restricting emergency-based tariffs, the court may indirectly influence inflation dynamics, supply chain costs, and consumer prices. At the same time, industries that benefited from tariff protection may now face renewed competition. That could reignite debates about industrial policy and strategic sectors. For allies and competitors alike, the signal is unmistakable. U.S. trade policy is not solely an executive weapon. It is embedded in a constitutional framework. In the long run, that might reshape negotiation strategies. Countries may invest more in lobbying Congress rather than focusing exclusively on White House diplomacy. They may time negotiations around electoral cycles differently. They may seek broader legislative agreements rather than temporary executive frameworks. So when we ask whether America has tied its own hands, the answer depends on what kind of power you value. Fast, unilateral, high-impact leverage. That may be constrained. Slower, institutionally grounded, and potentially more durable policy. That may be strengthened. What's clear is that this isn't just a legal footnote. It's a structural moment. The Supreme Court didn't rule on trade balances or supply chains. It ruled on constitutional authority. But in doing so, it may have altered how the world understands American economic power. And perhaps that's the deeper takeaway. Global trade competition is no longer just about who can impose higher tariffs or extract bigger concessions. It's about whose system can generate credible, stable, and enforceable commitments over time. The United States just demonstrated that even its most powerful elected official is constrained by institutional boundaries. For some, that looks like weakness. For others, it looks like long-term strength. The real test will come in the years ahead. If Washington can translate this institutional discipline into coherent, bipartisan trade strategy, then the ruling may ultimately enhance U.S. credibility. If polarization prevents legislative action and leaves policy in limbo, then the constraint could become paralysis. Either way, the structure of the game has shifted. And in global trade politics, when the rules of the game change, everyone from Brussels to Beijing recalculates. So the question isn't simply whether the Supreme Court blocked a set of tariffs. The question is whether America just redefined how it wields economic power in a competitive world. And that's a story that goes far beyond any single trade deal. Thanks for watching.